بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله حق حمده والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد خاتم أنبيائه ورسله وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. We reached the author's words ويكره التنفل قبل صلاة العيد في المصلى, correct? So it's makruh to perform nafil prayers before Salat al-Eid in the musalla by agreement, يعني وفي البيت عند عامتهم, and also at home according to the generality of the scholars. وهو الأصح, and this is the more correct opinion. But هو الأصح, this is the sound opinion. The other position is weak or has significant weakness, not to be acted upon. Right? لأن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم خرج فصلى بهم العيد لم يصلي قبلها ولا بعدها. The Messenger of Allah صلى الله عليه وسلم headed out and prayed Eid, led people in Eid prayer, and he did not pray before it nor after it. The hadith is in Bukhari and Muslim. And there's other evidences. When these works mention evidences, they're just mentioning, these are shawahid. These are supporting evidentiary texts. They're not, these are not, strictly speaking, adilla, in the sense that if you take these and apply the interpretive principles, you'll get the hukum. Okay. وَيُكْرَهُ التَّنَفُّلُ بَعْدَهَا. It's disliked to engage in nafil prayer after it, أي بعد صلاة العيد في المصلى فقط, in the musalla, in the place of praying Eid only. فلا يكره في البيت. It is not disliked at home, right? It's not disliked at home. على اختيار الجمهور, according to the vast majority of the ulama, right? There's a minority opinion that afterwards you could do it even in the place of Eid, but that is a lesser opinion in the madhab. It should not be practiced. لقول أبي سعيد, and but it is related from Qadi Khan and the author of the Tuhfa, but it's a lesser opinion in the madhab. لقول أبي سعيد الخدري رضي الله تعالى عنه وكان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لا يصلي قبل العيد شيئا. The Messenger of Allah صلى الله عليه وسلم would not pray before Eid anything. فإذا رجع إلى منزله صلى ركعتين. But if he returned home, he would pray 2 rak'ahs, meaning or more. Right? And the most important thing that is pending, what are these 2 rak'ahs or the 4 rak'ahs considered? Salatul Duha, right? Salatul Duha. So Salatul Duha remains recommended on Eid day, except that its recommendation shifts to after the Eid prayer for those who are going to pray Eid. Right? وابتداء وقت صحة صلاة العيد من ارتفاع الشمس قدر رمح أو رمحين. The beginning of the time for the validity of Eid prayer is from when the sun rises 1 or 2 shadow lengths. حتى تبيض, until it becomes pale, right? Because initially when it rises, it's intensely yellow. When it rises more, it now becomes pale. للنهي عن الصلاة وقت الطلوع, because of the interdiction against praying when the sun is rising. إلى أن تبيض, until it becomes clear. لأنه صلى الله عليه وسلم كان يصلي العيد حتى ترتفع الشمس قدر رمح أو رمحين. Because the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم used to pray Eid after the sun had risen the extent of 1 or 2 shadow lengths. فلو صلوا قبل ذلك لا يكونوا صلاة عيد بل نفلا محرما. And if they prayed before that, it would not count as Salat al-Eid, but rather it would be an impermissible nafl. Okay? Because that's a waqt of karahat tahrim. And right, and they say it is recommended, however, to hasten praying Salat al-Eid in its permissible time, particularly in Eid al-Adha, because that facilitates for people to take care of the ritual duties related to slaughter, etc., for Eid al-Adha. Right? Okay. And now, but there's a good discussion in Imam Tahtawi, right, that the awam are not prohibited from praying on so the rulings related to praying at the musalla, right, one needs to be particularly careful. Why? Because though makruh, etc., the prayer is valid, right? And one should not fall into a situation where one is, that it happened during the time of Sayyidina Ali ibn Abi Talib, and he says, I don't want to be of, and he didn't correct them. He said, I don't want to be of those who tell people, who forbid people from the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So, which doesn't mean it's right, it doesn't mean there's khilaf, but especially because at Eid, more people gather than even at Jumu'ah. And even people who don't even make it to Jumu'ah will show up, so they have to be dealt with the utmost of concern and wisdom. Right? And that should also reflect in the tone and content of the khutbah. Right? And it's a big mafsada. A lot of khutbahs, they're far too lengthy. There's far too much fundraising that happens, etc. Right? And that's where ahlan. No, keep it on, please. This is something that requires consideration. Okay. Right? So, and the way to deal with people could be encouraged that you tell people that, okay, we're going to be praying Salat al-Eid at this time. So you mention nicely. And just as a reminder of some of the things of this day, we welcome everyone and their families, etc. That what we're supposed to do today is 1, 2, and 3. The way we engage in extra worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on this day is by giving extra takbirs. If it's being done collectively, so you could please join in with that. That is better than praying, because the Prophet ﷺ didn't used to do that, etc., etc., etc. So, you put it in a positive way. Then if people are doing it, one does not correct them, not because it's not wrong, but because they're only not doing it because they don't know, right? And the harm of turning them away, singling them out, is very, very sensitive, right? But of course, they should be taught. And if there's many people doing it, one announces it, but don't be fattan. Don't be a source of fitna for them. Okay, how do you pray Salat عيد. He says وكيفية صلاتهما أي العيدين أن ينوي عند أداء كل منهما صلاة العيد. One performs the Eid prayers that when one intends Salat al-Eid بقلبه, with one's heart. And that's the niyyah itself. ويقول بلسانه, and one says with the tongue with the same tafsil. Some consider this to be generally recommended. Others said that it's يستحسن إن كان ذلك يستجمع عزمه, right? أو عزيمته. It's good if this helps gather your resolve, right? أصلي صلاة العيد لله تعالى إماما والمقتدي ينوي المتابعة أيضا. And one says with the tongue, I intend Salat al-Eid for the sake of Allah as Imam. And the follower intends following as well. And there's wisdom in saying it, that there's even studies that some people say that to help focus on what you're going to do, it helps to verbalize it. Right? Even in terms of behavioral psychology, they discuss, verbalize, like if you're going to go and do something, so you have purposefulness, they say, before you sit and study, you say, I'm going to study for the next 2 hours. Right? And even to, if you talk to yourself through it, it really helps focus and cut out other things. And that's good. It's a tool. ثم يكبر للتحريمة. Then one gives takbir for the tahrima. ثم يقرأ الإمام والمؤتم الثناء. Then both the imam and followers recite the thana, the opening supplication, سبحانك اللهم بحمدك إلى آخره. لأنه شرع في أول الصلاة فيقدم على التكبيرات الزوائد في ظاهر الرواية. Because the opening supplication, the سبحانك اللهم, this is legislated at the beginning of the prayer. So it is recited before the extra takbirs of the takbirat al-zawaid, the extra takbirs of the Eid prayer in ظاهر الرواية. Meaning there are other minority opinions to the contrary, but you don't have to worry about those. ثم يكبر. Then one gives takbir. الإمام والقوم. Then one gives takbir, both as imam and the followers. تكبيرات الزوائد, the extra takbirs. سميت بها لزيادتها على تكبير الإحرام والركوع. يكررها ثلاثا. They're called zawaid, they're called extra takbirs because they are above and beyond the opening takbir and the takbirs of ruku' and likewise. These are repeated 3 times. وهو مذهب ابن مسعود رضي الله تعالى عنه. And this is the position of Ibn Mas'ud and many other senior companions. Right? And Maulana al-Tahtawi mentions many of them. Right? But as a point of method, of course, these are not things to quote from Imam al-Tahtawi, just to be aware. Why? Imam al-Tahtawi is late. He's not a book of evidences, so he's quoting this indirectly. Right? And now, especially where we have access to the other resources, something like this, you would look for the Kutub al-Istidlal, the books of referencing, and from those you actually need to go back. At the very least, if you quote this from Fath al-Qadir, etc., that would be more proper. But anyways, that's a point of method. Like if we did have an assignment to ask you what is the basis of this, and you said this is, what's your reference? Tahtawi. Right? That's methodologically weak because Imam Tahtawi, that's like saying where's the hadith from? Said it's mentioned in Maraqi al-Falah. That's not where you seek these kinds of things. Okay, so one gives the this is the madhab of Ibn Mas'ud, and now multiple modes of giving the takbirat al-zawaid are related from the Prophet ﷺ, that he did it in different ways. The ikhtilaf is fil awlawiyya, in what is superior. ويسكت بعد كل تكبيرة مقدار 3 تكبيرات, and one pauses between each تكبيرة the extent of 3 تكبيرs. في رواية عن أبي حنيفة, in one narration from Abu Hanifa, لئلا يشتبه على البعيد عن الإمام, lest those distant from the Imam become confused. If you say Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, people who are far away could get confused because they might be relying on, you know, the muballigh. So one pause is enough for that. But this is not a required pause, right? And the issue is that one pause is enough that people won't be confused. So that depends on the circumstances, right? And how many people are there and so on. وَلَا يُسَنُّ ذِكْرٌ. There is no dhikr that is specifically sunnah between the takbirs. Right? وَلَا بَأْسَ بِأَنْ يَقُولْ Subhanallah walhamdulillah wa la ilaha illallah wallahu akbar. And there's nothing wrong with saying Subhanallah walhamdulillah wa la ilaha illallah wallahu akbar. Right? And others said that making tasbih is superior during that time, right? Whatever, so Allahu Akbar, Subhanallah, right? Alhamdulillah, whichever one one is able to do. But there's nothing specifically sunnah. Does not mean that one just remains silent without saying anything. يرفع يديه الإمام والقوم في كل منها وتقدم أنه سنة. And one raises one's hands both as imam as a follower in each of the extra takbirs. ثم يتعوذ. Then one makes a ta'awuth al-imam, and that's specific to the imam because the ta'awuth is for recitation. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. ثم يسمي سرا. ثم يقرأ الإمام الفاتحة ثم سورة. Then one says Bismillah quietly, and then the imam recites the Fatiha. ثم يقرأ سورة, and then one recites the surah. Right? And these are the wajibat of the prayer. وندب, it's recommended أن تكون سورة سبح اسم ربك الأعلى. That it's recommended the surah be سبح اسم ربك الأعلى تماما in its entirety. ثم يركع الإمام ويتبعه القوم. Then the imam goes into bowing and the people follow. فإذا قام للثالثة ابتدأ بالبسملة ثم بالفاتحة ثم بالسورة. Then when one gets up for the second rak'ah, one begins with the basmala, then the Fatiha, then the surah. Right? This is in order that the two recitations be together. Right? And that's superior in our madhab. It's not required, it is superior, أفضل. وندب أن تكون سورة أن تكون أي أن تكون السورة سورة. The ism كان is محذوف, right? أن تكون سورة هل أتاك حديث الغاشية. That it's recommended in the second rak'ah, the surah recited be سورة الغاشية. راه الإمام أبو حنيفة يرفعه إلى النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. This is related by Imam Abu Hanifa in what he relates with his chains of transmission to the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that the Messenger alayhi sallam used to recite in the Eid prayers and on Friday سبح اسم ربك الأعلى and هل أتاك حديث الغاشية. ورواه مرة في العيدين فقط. And in another narration it only mentions the two Eid prayers. This also in the works of Sunan as well. ثم يكبر الإمام والقوم تكبيرات الزوائد ثلاثا. And then after the recitation of the second rak'ah, they all recite the three extra takbirs, raising their hands. الإمام والقوم فيها, they raise their hands in them كما في الركعة الأولى, as in the first ركعة. وهذا الفعل وهو الموالاة بين القراءتين والتكبير ثلاثا في كل ركعة أولى. And this way of reciting the takbirs before the recitation, the first rak'ah, and after the recitation, the second rak'ah, so one is joining the takbirs are at either end of the recitation, which is uninterrupted in that sense, is superior. Right? In our madhab. It's not, meaning it's not required. It's superior. من زيادة التكبيرات على الثلاث. It's superior to what? One, to making more than 3 tasbihs in each rak'ah. ومن تقديم تكبيرات الزوائد في الركعة الثانية على القراءة. And it's superior than reciting the extra takbirs at the beginning of the rak'ah in the second rak'ah. لأثر ابن مسعود رضي الله تعالى عنه, because of what's narrated from Ibn Mas'ud رضي الله تعالى عنه, وموافقة جمع من الصحابة له قولا وفعلا, because a large group of companions explicitly agreed with him with their words, but also with their actions. وسلامته من الاضطراب, and this narration being the most free of any inconsistencies. وإنما اختير قوله لقول النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم, and his opinion was chosen لقول النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم رضيت لأمتي ما رضيه ابن أم عبد. I'm pleased for my ummah with what Ibn Abd is pleased with, right? Ibn Abd being Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. And this is related by al-Hakim and others. But because he is, as they say, he is أفقه الصحابة بعد الخلفاء. He's the most learned of the Sahaba after the Khulafa. وإن قدم التكبيرات في الركعة الثانية على القراءة جاز. But if one does the takbirat in the second rak'ah before the recitation, it is valid. لأن الخلاف في الأولوية, because the difference of opinion is on which one is superior. لا الجواز, not in terms of what is permissible. وعدمه, and وكذا لو كبر الإمام زائدا عما قلناه يتابعه المقتدي إلى 16 تكبيرة. If the Imam recites more takbirs than this, the follower follows him up to 16 takbirs, because that's the most that has been narrated. Right? فإذ زاد لا يلزمه متابعته. But the Imam just goes into takbir mode, like goes beyond 16, then one does not follow them. لأنه بعدها محظور بيقين بمجاوزته ما ورد من الآثار. Because beyond 16 takbirs, now one does not follow him because he's gone beyond anything that is soundly narrated from the Prophet ﷺ or the companions. وإذا كان مسبوقا يكبر فيما فاته. And if one is a latecomer, one gives takbir in what one has missed. بقول أبي حنيفة وإذا سبق بركعة يبتدئ في قضائها بالقراءة ثم كبر. لأنه لو بدأ بالتكبير ولا بين التكبيرات ولم يقل به أحد من الصحابة. Now if one missed one rak'ah, then one begins in one's makeup with the recitation first and then the takbirs. This is what's superior. Lest one do the recitation all in order to do the recitation all together. Right? And doing otherwise is not explicitly related. But of course, this is in terms of what is superior to do. فيوافق رأي الإمام علي بن أبي طالب فكان أولى. And that way one is in accordance with what is explicitly related from Sayyidina Ali bin Abi Talib, right? And that is أولى, right? وهو مخصص لقولهم المسبوق يقضي أول صلاته في حق الأذكار. And this is an exception to the general statement that they say that the latecomer makes up the beginning of their prayer with respect to the adhkar. Right? The latecomer, the one who, the masbuq who missed one rak'ah or more behind the imam, when they get up, what do they do first? They recite first. They have one rak'ah left to do. They recite first. Why? One, because that is what is most soundly narrated from the Sahaba, and they say, as you may have taken in usul, or what you see in usul is that the Hanafis leave the qiyas because of the athar of the Sahaba. Correct? Right? وإن أدرك الإمام راكعا أحرم قائما وكبر تكبيرات الزوائد قائما أيضا إن أمن فوت الركعة. Now if one catches the imam in ruku', one gives the takbir standing, and then one gives the extra takbirs, and if you're safe from missing the rak'ah بمشاركته الإمام في الركوع, by catching the imam in ruku'. وإلا يكبر لإحرام قائما. Otherwise one gives the opening takbir standing. ثم يركع مشاركا للإمام في الركوع. Then one gives ruku', does ruku' to catch the imam in the ruku'. ويكبر للزوائد منحنيا بلا رفع يد. And one does the extra takbirs in bowing position, but without raising your hands. It'd be quite an exercise to do that with raising your hands, right? Right? And there's an opinion, which is that of Abu Yusuf, that in this case, the Imam's takbir was enough for you and it's not required. And that's good to keep in mind. So someone said, I didn't do the extra takbirs. With Eid prayer, there's nothing you can do because you can't do it on your own afterwards, right? Right? So that's lifted by the fact that you prayed behind the Imam. You just have remorse. لأن الفائت من الذكر يقضى قبل فراغ الإمام. Right? Because what was missed of dhikr can be made up before the Imam is done. بخلاف الفعل, as opposed to the action, which i.e. the dhikr that is missed, which are the extra takbirs, they can be made up before the Imam's finished, as opposed to the action, which is the ruku'. But also because the ruku' shares some of the meanings of the standing. The ruku' shares some of the meanings of the standing, which is why if you catch the ruku', you're considered to have caught the rak'ah. Right? And other evidences which they mention. But this is what's narrated from some of the Sahaba, right? And that's one of the great wisdoms of the command to follow the Sahaba, right? That the hawadith and their واحتمالاتها, the things that happened and their possibilities are numerous. So it's from the lutf of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the fullest preservation of deen and guidance that we're given a tier after the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, which is the practice of the Sahaba and the actions of the tabi'een, etc., that detail out for us the understanding and implementation and application of the sunnah. والرفع حينئذ سنة في غير محله. But in bowing, raising one's hands would be a sunnah in other than his praise, because you don't raise your hands except in the standing position. So you don't do it. ويفوت السنة التي في محلها. And raising your hands in the ruku', going Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, would also cause you to miss the sunnah that belongs in the place, which is وهي وضع اليدين على الركبتين, which is to place the hands on one's knees. وإن رفع الإمام رأسه سقط عن المقتضي ما بقي من التكبيرات. If the Imam raises his head, i.e. from ruku', and the latecomer, i.e. the latecomer who only caught the Imam in Salat al-Eid in the bowing position, the rest of the takbirs are lifted from them. They're considered to have effectively caught them. لأنه إن أتى به في الركوع لزم ترك المتابعة المفروضة للواجب. Right? Because if one does the extra takbirs in ruku', this would entail leaving the required following with respect to the wajib actions. And this expression is little bit expansive. يعني المفروضة أي اللازمة. يعني أي اللازمة في هذا المحل. Right? Right? So we don't go and say, oh, Imam Shurumbalali's expression is wrong or whatever. Say, what is meant by it is this. Right? Because following the Imam without undue delay is wajib in general. Right? It's وإن أدركه بعد رفع رأسه قائما لا يأتي بالتكبيرات. But if the latecomer catches the Imam after the Imams raise their head, i.e. from ruku', one does not perform the بالتكبيرات. What kind of L is this? What kind of L is this, folks?
Referential?
Yeah, it's L al-ahd. What is it referring to? لا يأتي بالتكبيرات أي
الزوائد.
بتكبيرات الزوائد. Right? Always. And the asl of the L, the initial assumption is that this is referential. What is it referring to? Right? The man came. Would you think, like someone says, the man came? Like what comes to mind when you say the man came? Like the category of man? Al-insanu al-kamil? No, the man, the referential one. Right? That's just, and it's not just some theoretical thing, practically. The taxi is here. Which one? The one that's ma'hud, dhikran or dhihnan. Right? Right? That's just in human language. And the ulama talk about the asl for lam al-ta'rif in the usage of the Arabs. And that's the assumption that's made by the ulama of usul and fiqh and other things, that is referential. So one does not make لا يأتي بالتكبيرات أي تكبيرات الزوائد لأنه يقضي الركعة مع تكبيراته, because you'll be making up that rak'ah that you missed by not catching the Imam ruku', and you'll be performing the rak'ah with its takbirat. كذا في فتح القدير. This is what's mentioned in فتح القدير. ثم يخطب الإمام بعد الصلاة خطبتين. Then the Imam gives a khutbah after the prayer that has two khutbahs, meaning it has two parts. اقتداء بفعل النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم, following the actions of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم as related in the works of Sunan, etc. And this khutbah is, what is its ruling, folks? Yeah. It's sunnah, not, and it's not a shart, of course, right? And we took that. يعلم فيهما أحكام صدقة الفطر. Teaching in it the rulings of صدقة الفطر. لأن الخطبة شرعت لأجله. Because the khutbah has been legislated for this. Right? Has been legislated amongst the reasons been legislated. This is not exclusive. من مما شرعت له ذلك. يعني or لأجله أي لأجل التعليم. Right? Right? Has been legislated for it التعليم, but they say التعليم على وجه التذكير. Right? للدرس. Right? Right? No, it's not, the khutbah is not meant to be a dars. And Tahtawi, Imam Tahtawi rahimahullah quotes the author of Al-Bahr that this should also happen the Jumu'ah before the Eid, so that people are able to do the recommended act that they give Sadaqah al-Fitr before Jumu'ah, before Eid. Right? And okay. فيذكر من تجب عليه ولمن تجب ومما تجب ومقدار الواجب ووقت الوجوب. Right? So one teaches who has to pay Sadaqat al-Fitr, and to whom is it given, and what is it given from, and how much is given, right? And the time of obligation, right? ويجلس بين الخطبتين جلسة خفيفة, and one sits between the two khutbahs with a brief sitting, right? But not before it. So the Eid prayer is done, one goes straight and gives the khutbah, right? Unlike Jumu'ah, right? Jumu'ah, when the khatib goes to the minbar, he sits down. Adhan is given, right? Here, Eid prayer is done, go to the minbar and start giving the khutbah. ويكبر في خطبة العيدين, and it's recommended to give takbir in the khutbah of the two Eids. ليس لذلك عدد في ظاهر الرواية. There's no specific number regarding this in ظاهر الرواية. Right? Meaning عدد لازم. There's no required amount. لكن لا ينبغي أن يجعل أكثر الخطبة التكبير. But most of the khutbah should not be takbir. ويكبر في خطبة عيد الأضحى أكثر مما يكبر في خطبة الفطر. It is recommended that one give more takbirs in the khutbah of Eid al-Adha than in the khutbah of Eid al-Fitr. كذا في قاضي خان. So this is what's mentioned in Qadi Khan. And sometimes كذا, sometimes, not always, this is sort of slightly distancing himself from that or defending his position. There's another possibility that he's saying, well, look, it's there in Qadi Khan. But sometimes they say, Man asnada faqad ahal. Say, it's there that Qadi Khan said this. He's not necessarily, so he's relying on his saying it, he's not necessarily affirming that this is absolutely the case. And the reason why is that why would one be different from the other? And there are some discussions about why. ويستحب أن يستفتح الأولى بتسع تتراه أي متوالية. It's recommended that one open the first khutbah with 9 consecutive takbirs. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. But not rushing. You just Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Because that's like mumbling. والثانية بالسبع. And the second with 7. قال سيدنا عبد الله بن مسعود رضي الله تعالى عنه هو السنة. He said that this is the sunnah. أي هو ثابت بالسنة. Right? This is what's established in the sunnah, but is recommended. Because for it to be an emphasized sunnah would require the criteria for making it emphasized. وَيُكَبِّرُ الْقَوْمُ مَعَهُ. And the people also give the takbir, but quietly. Right? Not out loud. وَيُصَلُّونَ عَلى النَّبِي صلى الله عليه وسلم في أنفسهم. And they send blessings on the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم within themselves. امتثالا للأمر وسنة الإنصات. While to obey the command, صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما, for example, or the command that, the command that's understood indirectly, right? That because a command is understood indirectly from warnings. البخيل من ذكرت عنده وَلَمْ يُصَلِّ عَلَيْهِ. The miser is the one in whose presence I mentioned and who hasn't sent blessings upon me. And other such texts. While observing the sunnah of being quietly attentive. So one says it to oneself, meaning quietly. Right? And like the Friday Jummah. And the Sunnat al-Insat, Imam Tahtawi of course says, a wajib al-Insat, right? Right? The duty of being silent, right? ومن فاتته الصلاة فلم يدركها مع الإمام لا يقضيها. Whoever misses the prayer with the Imam does not make it up. لأنها لم تعرف قربة إلا بشرائط لا تتم بدون الإمام أي السلطان أو مأموره فإن شاء انصرف وإن شاء صلى نفلا. Right? Because it's not, the Eid is only done formally and congregationally with the Imam, the Sultan, or the one with the permission, or by the formal establishing of it by a group of Muslims. So if they wish, so someone got to the Musalla and they missed it, then they can just return home, or they can pray a nafl. And it's best that they pray. وَالْأَفْضَلْ أَرْبَعٌ فيكون النفل له صلاة الضحى فيكون له صلاة الضحى لما روي عن سيدنا ابن مسعود رضي الله تعالى عنه أنه قال من فاتته صلاة العيد صلى 4 ركعات يقرأ في الأولى سبح اسم ربك الأعلى وفي الثانية والشمس وضحاها وفي الثالثة والليل إذا يخشى وفي الرابعة والضحى. Right? Because it's related from Abdullah ibn Mas'ud that if someone misses Salat al-Eid, they should pray 4 rak'ahs, and these count as Salat al-Duha legally, right? With the suggested recitation mentioned. وروي ذلك عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم, and this has also been related from the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. Right? وعدا جميلا وروي في ذلك عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم وعدا جميلا وثوابا جزيلا. And it's related from the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم that this has a beautiful promise and deep reward. Right? Then he says وتؤخر صلاة العيد الفطر بعذر. Right? The prayer of Eid al-Fitr can be delayed due to an excuse. كأن غم الهلال وشهدوا بعد الزوال, such as if it was cloudy, so they didn't see the crescent, and they saw it after zawal time, because that's no longer the time of the prayer. أو صلوها في غيب فظهر أنها كانت بعد الزوال, or they prayed it in extremely cloudy conditions, and turns out that they prayed it after Dhuhr time had entered, so it would not have been valid. إلى الغد فقط, it can only be delayed 1 day. This is exceedingly rare in our time, but let's say there is extraordinary storms and so on, and people weren't able to gather. It could happen in the more northerly parts of Canada, for example. There's a major snowstorm. They said it's not safe to go to Eid prayer. They could make a call that we are due to unforeseen circumstances, we are delaying Eid prayer till day 2, and this is legislated. Right? لأن الأصل فيها أن لا تقضى كالجمعة. The basis of it, and this is the qiyas, right, is that Jumu'ah, the Eid prayer, resembles Jumu'ah in so many ways, it would not be made up. إلا أن تركناه لما روينا من أنه صلى الله عليه وسلم أخرها إلى الغد بعذر. Okay? But they left the qiyas, the analogy, due to what has been soundly narrated, and this is khabar ahad. And if you've done usul, or when you come to do some usul, if you remember, in the Hanafi school, the qiyas is left for khabar al-ahad, for singular transmission. Right? And the singular transmission means that transmissions, even if the transmission isn't mashhur or mutawatir, right? And that comes up. That the Prophet ﷺ delayed Eid al-Fitr due to an excuse. وَلَمْ يُرْوَى أَنَّهُ أَخَّرَهَا إِلَى مَا بَعْدَهُ. But it's not related that the Prophet ﷺ delayed it beyond one day. فَيَبْقَى عَلَى الْأَصْلِ. So beyond that, it would remain on the basis. وَقَيَّدَ الْعُذْرِ لِلْجَوَازِ لا وقيد العذر قيد العذر للجواز لا لنفي الكراهة. Right? And the excuse is a condition for permissibility, not only to lift dislikedness. فإذا لم يكن عذر لا تصح في الغد. Because if there's no excuse, it's just, let's say Eid falls on a Friday, so they say, you know guys, in the Hanafi school you can just pray it on Saturday. You can just delay it a day. No, you can't. Eid prayer is done on Eid day. The excuse has to be a sufficient excuse. Right? And then he says, then he tells us about ahkam wa Eid al-Fitr. So we will look at this briefly. It says, وَأَحْكَامُ عِيدِ الْأَضْحَى كَالْفِطْرِ. The rulings of Eid al-Adha are like those of Eid al-Fitr. وَقَدْ عَلِمْتَهَا. And you've seen them. لكنه في الأضحى يؤخر الأكل عن الصلاة. But in Eid al-Adha, one delays eating till after the prayer. استحبابا. This is recommended. Right? And this is important to remind people, right? Because you can't always just tell people what's better, because there are people who have medical conditions, all kinds of situations where there will be hardship, right? So you have to balance between encouraging what's better, but also not making what's better as if it's required, right? That's a delicate balance, and that's why you should listen to the lessons of the Shaykh. How do they explain these things to the common public? Right? That's very, very important. Right? فإن قدمه لا يكره في المختار. But if one eats first, it is not makruh. Right? And it's not makruh either at all, according to some scholars. Others would say it's not makruh, meaning it's khilaful awla. Some would say that it's not makruh, meaning it's not makruh tahriman, but it is makruh tanzihan. And that's the position chosen by Sayyid al-Hamawi and Ibn Abdin. In Tahtawi likes this, right? Because he says, إِذْ لَا بُدَّ مِنَ الْكَرَاهَةِ لِتَرْكِ السُّنَّةِ. But this is not entirely acceptable. Why? Right, so Tahtawi quotes Alam al-Hamawi that what's negated is karahat al-tahrim, because it is, there is necessarily karaha in leaving the sunnah. Do you agree with that or do you not? Anyone? That if you leave a sunnah, Does it mean that there's karaha? So we know what we mean by sunnah here. It's istihbab, it's written for you. No, so the question is, Imam al-Tahtawi quotes Allama al-Hamzawi, that you're leaving a sunnah, so there has to be karaha. Do we agree with that?
According to Imam al-Shumbulari's breakdown of what makes something makruh, no.
Why?
Because leaving a sunnah action is not makruh tahriman. Makruh tahriman is for leaving a
Okay, forget the makruh tahriman. But is it makruh tanzihan to leave a recommended act? No. So okay, so we know leaving an emphasized sunnah, we know it's makruh tanzihan with blameworthiness. But leaving the recommended, leaving a specifically recommended sunnah, is it necessarily makruh tanzihan? And of course, without excuse, is it makruh tanzihan? No, not necessarily, right? Even if it be specific. This is from the rahmah of our deen. And that's why here I have a footnote that I've put on my copy here, that لكن قد حقق في البحر أن ترك المستحب لا يستلزم الكراهة. But Allama ibn Nujaym in al-Bahr al-Ra'iq has an excellent discussion that leaving the recommended action does not necessarily entail karaha, even karaha tanzih. بل لا بد لإثبات الكراهة من دليل. But rather, establishing that not doing something recommended is makruh would require its own proof. Right? What's the ruling of 4 rak'ahs before Asr? It's mandub, it's mustahab. Now, if someone didn't do it, was it karahat tanzih that they didn't do it? No, they left the mustahab. And may Allah, forgive us and improve our will. It's not makruh, because otherwise we'd be drowned, like we would be, no, that's rahmah. That's rahmah. It requires evidence, explicit or like tastajmi' fihi ma'ani, right? So be careful about that. Just because you left a sunnah, or someone left a sunnah, does not mean that's makruh, right? And like the Prophet said, لا تضيق واسعا. At the same time, of course, we encourage people towards the best, but بدون تضييق, right? And especially in our times where people have such limited religious results, you give an encouragement, but don't over-encourage. Why? Because over-encouraging, people imagine, right? It's like Shaykh Talal Ahdab mentioned that once he was driving Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda between cities here in Canada. Forget which 2 cities they were. And it's ironic, I forgot. He said, Shaykh Abdul Fattah was just making dhikr. Then he looked at Shaykh Talal and said, أتدري من العامي? Do you know who the unlearned person is? So he said, right? That من إذا قيل له زيد, the عامي, do you know who the unlearned person is? That if you say Zayd to him, سمع عمرو, he'll hear that it was Amr. وذكر أنه بكر. وإذا تحدث قال خالد. Right? So the unlearned person is one who, if you say to him Zayd, he hears it was Amr. He remembers it as being Bakr, and when he relates it, will say it was Khalid. Right? So that's why when you convey things to in general, you have to make ta'keedul ma'ani. Make sure they understood it clearly, and to avoid iftitan, that they not get confused. They don't be overwhelmed, right? You have to be Very careful about that. With that, one of the hikmahs of the Prophet ﷺ is, the Prophet ﷺ, if he said something, he'd repeat it multiple times. Which is one of the ways we understand, even from an individual hadith, sometimes there are slight variants, because the Prophet ﷺ, he would repeat the things he said multiple times for emphasis. Right? Okay. لأنه صلى الله عليه وسلم كان لا يطعم في يوم الأضحى حتى يرجع فيأكل من أضحيته. The Prophet ﷺ did not partake of food on, and it's with فتح الياء, يطعم, that he would not eat, because he said يطعم, he would not feed others, right? He would not eat on Eid al-Adha until he returned home and would and eat from his udhiyah, from from the ritual slaughter. فلذا قيل لا يستحب تأخير الأكل إلا لمن يضحي ليأكل منها أولا. And that's why it's said that it's not recommended to delay eating except for the one who's going to be slaughtering, in order that they eat from that slaughter first. لذا قيل. That's why some said. Right? Right? But in general, but here Sayyid Abu Su'ud al-Azhari, he's quoted by Tahtawi that it's recommended in general not to eat before. Right? That's why this is mentioned by Qil. Right? ويكبر في الطريق ذاهبا إلى المصلى. One gives takbir on the route headed towards the musalla jahran, out loud in Eid al-Adha. So practically, if a family is going towards Eid al-Adha, it would be recommended for them to give takbirs together. Right? And if you raise your voice, to raise your voice with it. And if the group, they make it together, to raise one's voice. Istihbaban. This is recommended. It's not required, but it's superior. And fit tariq, meaning till you reach the place. And some said you continue the whole time up to and including the khutbah. Right? And that narration is what is being practiced upon by most people for centuries. That you make takbir on the way and all the way till the prayer. And mentioned by Tahtawi. Right? Right? كما فعل النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم, as done by the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. And here there's a number of useful points. Right? Right? That Tahtawi mentions from الزاهدي ولا يسن التكبير جهرا في غير هذه الأيام إلا بإزاء عدو. It's not specifically sunnah to give the takbir out loud in other than these days, except in the face of the enemy. أو لصوص, or their thieves. Right? You could say, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. And you scare the thief. Right? If they're scared by that. قيل وكذا الحريق. And some said even during a fire. Seeking Allah's assistance, but of course while also putting it out. والمخاوف, in times of fear. كلها, in all times of fear. Right? Right? This is one of the useful things. And other fuqaha mentioned this too, that in a time of fear there's many things one can do. One of the things is to say Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Go take care of what the fear is, but you make dhikr. Just like, if you're in the ru'b, one also can give the adhan. So, of course, not the adhan that people think you're calling to prayer, but just to oneself, that helps settle one, right? There are many places where the adhan is recommended. Or just dhikr in general, right? But takbir can be given out loud also in a situation of fear. And بعد تكرار, because that helps, because in any response has two components, right? Which is there's the aspect of al-akhd bil-asbab and the aspect of al-tawakkul, or al-i'timad ala Allah, taking the means and reliance upon Allah. إياك نعبد, that's al-akhd bil-asbab. إياك نستعين, right? That is the i'timad ala Allah, right? إياك نعبد, you alone we worship, that is the taking of means, right? And we take the means sincerely. إياك نستعين, this is our i'timad, that's our reliance and dependence on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But that aspect of غرس الاعتماد على Allah, of cultivating the i'timad on Allah, is helped by remembrance of Allah, right? So, and sometimes it helps to hear one say, Subhanallah, Alhamdulillah. There's clearly beneficial sometimes, especially in difficult times, to raise one's voice with dhikr. It helps, because the more senses are involved in an act, the more impactful it is on one's consciousness, right? So this helps people significantly. So that's a very, very precious fa'idah. وَيُعَلِّمُ الْأُضْحِيَةِ, and one teaches the udhiyah in the khutbah. And it's recommended also, as what the author of the Bahr mentioned, this to be taught leading up to it, right? فَيُبَيِّنُ مَنْ تَجِبْ عَلَيْهِ وَمِمَّا تَجِبْ وسن الواجب ووقت ذبحه وسن الواجب ووقت ذبحه والذابح وحكم الأكل والتصدق والهدية والادخار. So one clarifies the rulings of the udhiyah, of whom is it required from, and from what is it required, and the age of the animal that is required, and the time of slaughtering, and the criteria for the one who slaughters. Because while it is recommended it's from the sunnah that one slaughter oneself, but this is in kana yuhsinu dhabh, if one can slaughter properly, لحق الحيوان, right? Because of the rights of the animal, right? Because if someone doesn't know, they'll mess up, right? And that could cause the udhiyah to be fasida. And the rulings related to eating from it, right? And of giving it in charity, right? That the sunnah is that one consume a third and gift a third, wal hadiyah wal iddikhar, right? The sunnah is that one consume a third, oneself and family and others, one gift a third, and one store a third, right? But if one has more need for this for one's family, someone's poor, then they can store more of it to the extent of the need of their family, because the Prophet ﷺ said, "Ibda binafsik, thumma man ta'ul." Begin with yourself, then those you're responsible for. وَيُعَلِّمُ تَكْبِيرَ التَّشْرِيقِ, right? And one teaches the takbir of tashriq, من إضافة الخاص إلى العام, right? The takbir of the days of tashriq في الخطبة, in the khutbah. لأن الخطبة شرعت له. The khutbah was legislated for instruction. وينبغي للخطيب التنبيه عليها في خطبة الجمعة التي يليها العيد، أي قبل العيد. And it's befitting that the khatib also remind regarding this in the khutbah of the Jum'ah that comes before Eid. This is from the bahath of the author of Bahr al-Ra'iq. وتؤخر صلاة عيد الأضحى بعذر. And the Eid al-Adha prayer is delayed, can be delayed due to excuse. لنفي الكراهة وبلا عذر مع الكراهة لمخالفة المأثور. But here in Eid al-Fitr, if you can only be delayed one day if there's an excuse. Without an excuse, Eid al-Fitr, Salat of Eid al-Fitr is not valid. Salat of Eid al-Adha can be delayed with an excuse. And if it's delayed with an excuse, there's no karaha. If delayed without an excuse, Salat Eid al-Adha is valid with karaha, i.e. karaha tahrim, because one's going against the texts. But because these are all days of udhiyah, right? The ayyam al-tashriq, these are all days of slaughtering in one sense, right? إلى ثلاثة أيام, for 3 days. لأنها مؤقتة بوقت الأضحية, because it is delimited by the days of udhiyah, which are 3. فيما بين الارتفاع إلى الزوال, between its time, right? Sunrise to zawal time. ولا تصح بعدها, it cannot be done after zawal time on any of the days. والتعريف وهو التشبه بالواقفين بعرفات ليس بشيء. As for ta'rif, which is to imitate the people at Arafat, is nothing. Meaning it's not done. ليس بشيء معتبر. It's not a recognized thing. فلا يستحب اليكره في الصحيح لأنه اختراع في الدين. But rather it's disliked, according to sound opinion, because it is something made up in the religion. Right? And be makruh tahriman. But this is if you say that we are making this a gathering like the gathering at Arafah. Right? So you say, they gather at Arafah, we gather here. And this is, you're getting the reward of gathering for Arafat. That's made up, because that is there's ibadat makhsusa, and there's ibadat mutlaqa, and there's general ibadat. Dhikr, so what's the proof of making dhikr on a sofa? Do you need proof for making dhikr sitting on a sofa? No. Uskuruni yadhkurkum. What's the proof that you're making dua after eating chocolate, a chocolate pudding? Is there anything that after chocolate? No, because it's mutlaq. But they say if one gathers on that day للتذكير, for reminder and encouragement, etc., without tashabbuh bi ahl Arafat, there's nothing wrong with that. Right? Because فذكر, because that falls under التذكير العام. فذكر فإن الذكرى تنفع المؤمنين, because reminders benefit believers. And you take, but what is التعريف is saying, is this التشبه بأهل عرفة? That doesn't have a basis. Because what are you going to do next? Also do a tawaf? So we're just walking around the masjid. They're making hajjat tawaf al-wada'. We're making tawaf wada' al-masjid. No, that's right. ولا يخفى ما يحصل من رعاع العامة باجتماعهم واختلاطهم بالنساء. And it's evident, or it's not lost on people, what happens when the ignorant common people gather and mix with the women, etc., والأحداث, and the young في هذا الزمان, in this time. وَدَرْءُ الْمَفْسَدَ مُقَدَّمًا, avoiding harm is given precedence. It also depends on context, right? So in Cairo, in Egypt, this was a problem, right? Like they made this observation that most North African scholars, when they're in North Africa, there's many Malikis like this, many fuqaha of the people of Tasawwuf, for example, in North Africa, they used to say group dhikr is praiseworthy. Once they got to Egypt, they said it's not allowed. Why? Because of what they saw of how it was being done, right? And some of these things can also be contextual because of it, right? Like in some places, people say there's all kinds of things related to visiting graves. That it's mafsada because of this, and this. But some cities, you see that problem. Other places, you don't. Right? Right? Damascus, old Damascus is surrounded by graveyards. But you go there, you don't see people. But I lived in the area known as Bab Saghir. And that's where a lot of the Sahaba, Ridwanullahi alayhim, are buried. You wouldn't see, besides where the Shuhada Karbala are, because some of our attitudinally divergent brethren would go there, of the Shia, they do some colorful things. But in the maqabir of Ahl Sunnah, you wouldn't see anything unusual. Right? It's actually kind of boring in comparison with what you'd see in the Indian subcontinent or other places I've been. Right? So some things you have to keep in mind the context. Okay. And then we look at the takbirat al-tashriq bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. And next class we will also do al-kusuf wal-khusuf bi-idhnihi subhanahu wa ta'ala. These are very straightforward chapters. And then al-istisqa is also we'll be going relatively fast. So, yeah. And then salat al-khawf. The summary of salat al-khawf is that you can do it this way, but it's better to pray in multiple groups. Right? So we hope in the next week to get to janaiz bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. So just at least. Right? So tighten your seatbelts, inshallah. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.